Looking back on over 10 years of AI in games, there's been over 100 videos on the channel, and a variety of topics that I've covered. Some of them have proven very popular, some not so much. But which ones do I personally have some attachment to? For this episode, as part of the 10-year celebration of AI in games, I took on a question submitted by the community of what are my favourite episodes. But I realise this risks me being a bit self-indulgent, and it's so terribly un-British to speak publicly about how great your contributions are, so I decided rather than focus on my opinions on which of the videos are my personal favourites, I want to focus on videos that mean a lot to me personally, that have special stories behind their creation, and otherwise just hold a special place in my deep-fried heart.
So, it's story time. It's worth saying that none of these are in any particular order, and I love them all equally. So with that, let's get started.
So before I get into specific episodes which have particular stories behind them, I will mention some videos that I'm quite fond of. Episode 14, Transformers Fall of Cybertron. Episode 47, Halo Wars 2. Episode 56, Watch Dogs 2. Episode 59, which was Gears Tactics. Episode 66, which is Doom, the original Doom, not the 2016 reboot. And episode 71 on Halo Infinite.
So why these videos? Well, these videos are about games that I really enjoy playing. Contrary to popular belief, I don't actually enjoy all the games I cover on the series. But, I'm a professional. I can recognise the technical contributions and educational value of a game, even when I don't enjoy it. This, of course, then makes it quite hilarious to me when some people will complain in the comments about a game that I cover because they didn't like it for whatever reason and really want me to know about it, and sometimes use that as a mechanism to discredit the topic that we're covering in the video itself. To quote Anita Sarkeesian, we must be critical of the art we love. But I'd also like to add, we must also recognise the contributions of art we dislike. Sure, it's not as pithy a quote, but it kinda serves my point.
Also, it's worth giving a special shout out to Derek Fagan, an AI programmer at Creative Assembly, who helped out with the Halo Wars 2 video. That episode really came together thanks to a little bit of extra support from the studio. And on that note, thank you to Lucy Boxall, the communications manager, who has tolerated many an email of mine over the years. Sadly, with the exception of Doom and Halo Wars 2, almost none of these videos did well in terms of views. But hey, who cares? I like them, I'm proud of them, and I think they're interesting. Go watch them if you haven't already. Plus, I want to give a special mention to episodes that I am particularly pleased with how they turned out, considering the challenges I faced in putting them together. That would be Episode 30 on Doom 2016, Episode 45 on Hitman 2016, Number 60, that was Forza's Drivatar, and lastly, the most recent episode of AI in Games, Number 74, Marvel's Spider-Man.
Each of these were a mountain of work to put together, with most of them taking me weeks to research and write. Writing any episode of AI in Games is often a mixture of two challenges: finding the information I need and then digesting it myself sufficiently such that it turns into a cohesive story or narrative for me to share with you. But critically, I need to be able to back up anything I say. If I'm not confident that what I've written is the actual truth, then I'm not willing to proceed with the topic until I have the sources to back it up. On that note, there are many episodes that are half written and never completed, because they lack that one thing that really brings it all together. In fact, the video on Doom 2016 is a great example of this, given there were some GDC talks on parts of its inner workings in areas of combat design and animation, but never the guts of the main AI systems themselves. It sat half-written for about a year. It relied on a developer of the game coming forward and explaining it to me in detail. And in fact, the reason that developer came forward was because the Design Dive episode on Doom that I'd released beforehand. That developer shall remain anonymous, given they asked for that to be the case, but of course I then had to go and do my due diligence in ratifying that this person was who they said they were, which is what I do anytime this sort of situation crops up. Conversely, I had a completely different situation with Hitman. I was working on this episode and I actually got a DM on Twitter from the comms team at IO Interactive offering to help. They actually watched the original version of that episode, and critically they got the AI team to watch it, and then they sent me feedback. Largely to clarify some points that I didn't know about, and actually also to point out some mistakes that I should fix. All of that feedback was then taken on board and made that episode one of my more popular ones. So yeah, thanks to the team at IO for helping me out. Alright, so with that, let's get into the stories. I got some really particular weird tales to dig into.
Okay, first one to talk about, AI in games number 29, Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops is a fantastic third-person shooter that is also one of the few games out there that truly tries to tackle the themes that surround war and conflict. Episode 29 digs into its inner workings, and it's one of my favourite episodes, not just because we got to cover what I think is an important game of its era, but it's also the first episode that really came to life courtesy of a guest interview, in this instance with Jörg Reisig, who was an AI programmer at Jaeger during the game's development.
So I met Jörg in person at an event called Game AI North, which ran in Copenhagen in October of 2017. I was actually invited to come and speak on a panel about designing great AI for games. Shout out to Richard Kogelnig, who'd invited me to it. And I was in a bit of a weird time for myself professionally. I was trying to get out of my academic career as I was deeply unhappy with it. I dropped to working 1 day a week at the university, and I was doing contract work where I could to try and start building a portfolio for myself in the industry. In fact, I could barely afford the trip to Copenhagen, and I ended up staying in an Airbnb of a local family who lived across the street from the venue in their apartment. And so yeah, once again, thanks to Richard for inviting me to the panel, and of course to Emil Johansson and the rest of the crew who ran Game AI North, given it had a huge impact on my channel and it was a fantastic event. Critically, my videos on Halo Wars 2, Ghost Recon Wildlands and Horizon Zero Dawn came about courtesy of the talks delivered at that event, plus of course Spec Ops: The Line, and, as we'll talk about in a minute, my 4-part entry on Sea of Thieves. So my time at Game AI North is special, not just because of the videos it created, but also it was one of the first times I was involved in one of these events where people were beginning to take my YouTube work seriously. I met attendees who knew who I was and they watched my videos and were very friendly and keen to chat with me. But then of course there was the panel. Now, despite my positive interaction with devs, I still felt like a bit of a fraud, given on the panel I sat next to Jörg, who's on the panel with me on one side, and then on the other side is Alicia Ledeker, who was previously on the AI Summit Advisory panel at GDC and had been one of the AI leads on the early days of Assassin's Creed. Nonetheless, both were super nice, and I had a great time on the panel. It was only afterwards, as many of the attendees hung out at a nearby bar, that Jörg and I got chatting more, during which we talked about Spec Ops quite a bit, and he offered to be interviewed for a future video. And so the final episode emerged around 9 months later, and it's still one I'm very proud of. I'll also take a moment to reaffirm how lovely a dude Jörg is. We bumped into each other at GDC earlier this year, and it was just great to shoot the shit for 10 minutes. Like, just a wonderful human being.
Next up, AI in games number 44, Goldeneye 007. So the AI of Goldeneye is one of my favourite episodes. It's a popular game from my childhood, all my friends played it in high school, but I wanted to talk about this episode because it's not just fun to talk about how it came together, but it's an episode that subsequently led to several other projects I worked on outside of YouTube.
So yeah, first of all, the video. This actually came about courtesy of a friend, Dan Scales, who is not only a former student of mine, but I actually subsequently worked for him for a time as a contract programmer. Dan was, at the time, an organiser for the Norwich Games Festival, an event that runs here in the UK, and critically, I used to run educational workshops for school kids with Sean Spalding, who you might know on YouTube for their work making Game Maker tutorials. Plus, I used to showcase my own stuff, like my game Sure Footing, and I got to hang out with the likes of Mel Phillips, who was recently on Branching Factor. Plus, that's where I got to know George and Quang, my podcast co-hosts, a lot better. Plus, this reminds me that one day I actually need to tell the story of how we were showcasing our little platformer next to the very first public demo of a small little indie darling called Overcooked. And so, yeah, Phil, Ollie, hope you're keeping well, lads. Anyways, one of the big speakers that Dan had managed to get in to talk at the festival was none other than Dr. David Doak, who was a developer on Goldeneye. In fact, David had already presented a really nice post-mortem on the game at NGF, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to chat to him about the AI stuff? But I was conscious about cold calling him out of the blue like that. So I asked Dan to introduce us, and David was really friendly and was kind enough to give a couple of hours of his time. And it was a really fun conversation that led to my making the video, a video that subsequently did really well. And I love being able to share it around, and I love that people still talk about that episode today. But it's actually worth highlighting the extra stuff that kicked off as a result. So the following year, the episode came out in 2019, so this is early 2020, right before COVID lockdowns, I'm invited to be interviewed for a documentary about the making of Goldeneye 007, which would later be called Golden Era. So I actually have a single credit on IMDb just for being part of this documentary, which is kind of hilarious. And it's also a really good doc and worth watching. They got a lot of the dev team back, as well as notable journalists from across the industry. Strangely, I was actually rather excited to be in the same video as Giant Bomb's Dan Reichert. I'm sure Jeff Bakalar will immediately think less of me as a result, but anyway. And this led to another project. So the documentary was directed by a fella called Drew Roller, who is based out in Australia. In fact, when he interviewed me for Golden Era, he'd just flown into the country and was doing this whistle-stop tour of the UK to grab some final interviews with a few developers, and then of course, not long after, the whole world was in lockdown. Fast forward a year or so later, Drew's doing some work over at Digital Load, a game studio that specialises in VR games, and it was Drew who put in a good word for me that Load with the studio director, Mike Bell, and I wound up working for a time on F.E.A.R 2, which is now available on the Quest 2. So yeah, one YouTube episode led to a documentary and my working on my first VR game. Not bad! On that note, my love to Mike, Sherry, Josh, F.E.A.R, Annie Mae and the rest of the F.E.A.R 2 team. It was great working with you, despite never getting the chance to meet about 99% of the studio in person. One closing point about the Goldeneye video is when I recently announced my 10 years later episode where I reflected on my experiences, David wrote some very kind words about me and my work on Twitter. And I'm not going to lie, I usually try to separate church and state around here. My love for games and the people that work on them is separated from my work on exploring them. But having the Dr. Doak write that did bring a tear to my eye. It was very kind of him.
AI in Games numbers 40 through 43, Sea of Thieves. Given Spec Ops was achieved courtesy of bumping into a dev at Game AI North, I couldn't possibly forget to talk about my experiences working on the deep dive on Sea of Thieves.
So, on my first evening in Copenhagen, I'd sat chatting with Jorg, and on another night that same week, I think it might have been the same night, I found myself at a table with Andy Bastable and Rob Masella, two developers who at that time were based at Rare working on Sea of Thieves, which was only about 5 months away from release at that time. We'd been chatting quite happily, but a couple of times our conversation was put on pause as developers would come over to say hi to me and thank me for my work on YouTube, which is of course super lovely, very humbling. Bearing in mind this is only about 3.5 years after the channel was started, so I felt like a horrendous fraud. Well, not much has changed there, but it was after this happened twice that Andy asked me what that was all about, and I explained, people know me as a YouTuber, and believe me, this doesn't get any easier to explain the older I get. But then after that, we got back to our regular conversation. And then the following day, Andy tells me that he'd sat and watched some of my videos that night back at his hotel, and he really enjoyed them. He then gave me his business card. And he said, look, I'd love to chat to you about the stuff we're doing in Sea of Thieves. He was particularly fond of the work his team had done on the Sharks, as I recall. Of course, there was no point in reaching out now. The game wasn't even out yet, but the idea sat in the back of my head for a time. And then one morning, I was going through business cards after a recent event, and I stumbled upon Andy's card again. And this would have been close to a year later. Sea of Thieves had been out for around 6 months or so at this point. And I thought, why not? So I dropped him an email, asking if he'd be up for it. And within around 2 weeks of back and forth, we'd agreed on a date where I was to be invited to the studio to interview some of the team. So myself and my buddy, Matt Syret, we went over to Rare for the day. We booked the day off work, and Matt was both our driver and he was also the cameraman, given at that time I'd never done anything like this before, so I didn't really know what I was doing. So we romp on up to the small village of Twycross, where Rare is based. It wasn't my first time visiting the studio. I'd previously had students do internships there, and I would do visits to check in on them. So I knew the location, but it was the first time I really got to see a lot of the day-to-day as the team were working on a game. Though we were only allowed on one side of the building, given early phase work on what I presume was Everwild was happening on the other half of the campus. So we spent the whole day at the studio, as we interviewed several members of the team. We then had lunch at the canteen, and generally just went for a wander to have a look at how the game actually is being built, and watching as they're adding more and more new content. I've never had that level of access to a studio before nor since, given the subsequent collaborations with Ubisoft all happened remotely during COVID. So hey, if you're a studio who wants to invite me down to meet your team and dig into how your game works, drop me a line. But the funniest part of this whole thing was also at the time the most frustrating. In order to get the videos out, we needed the communications team at Rare to approve them. This is, of course, a standard thing. They'd invited me to the studio, I'd interviewed the developers, and I was under a non-disclosure agreement. I'd signed an NDA. They had to agree that what was shared was an acceptable use of the NDA, making sure that the videos were on point, accurate, and not defaming or slamming the studio. Like, this is quite a standard process and not an issue. It's part of making these videos a reality. But the problem was, we'd never really briefed the comms team on what we were going to talk about, and what was or wasn't acceptable content to put in the video. What I mean by that is, we could perhaps have a conversation about a core system in the game, but it would be agreed that it wouldn't appear in the video. This is sometimes useful, given it helps me understand some production realities about the game, even if I don't share that particular piece of information with you directly. But it might influence how I script the episode or explain a key aspect of the material. So the team at Rare finally get to see the first draft, and they were mortified. They realised just how much the devs had told me about the underlying systems in Sea of Thieves, that they were worried that if I got it out there, the player community would then exploit that knowledge for their own benefit. And I both agree with some aspects of that decision, and I'd actually cut some stuff out, while also disagreeing with a lot of stuff that I felt personally was harmless. They didn't see it that way. As a result, there's about 20 minutes worth of material from those interviews we had to cut out of the Sea of Thieves episodes. Now, funnily enough, if you then read the comments of the Sea of Thieves videos, people will be in there stating that they believe certain systems or behaviours only trigger in certain contexts. Now, I know which of those predictions and assertions was actually true, or was true at that time. Who knows, the game has changed a lot in the years since. But like I say, we had to cut about 15 to 20 minutes worth of content that the studio didn't want acknowledged. Nonetheless, I'm still super happy with these videos, and I'm very grateful to Andy and Rob, plus the rest of the team, for taking the time to chat with us. So of course that's Sarah Noonan, Stuart Holland, Tristan Bell, and Chantel Porritt. I'm also very grateful to Matt, who was happy to help out. Plus, I learned a lot from that experience about how to conduct these interviews when working with a studio. It had a huge influence on my subsequent projects, especially the Division 2 and Watch Dogs Legion episodes I did with Ubisoft. They went really smoothly by comparison, and I'm still very proud of how they turned out.
AI in Games number 15, Alien Isolation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Of course, he's going to put one of the Alien Isolation videos in there. Those are the videos that have the most views. They're the videos everyone knows the channel for. Well, yeah, but I have to say episode 15, the first video about Alien Isolation, is really not one of my favourites. The audio is busted, the editing is bad, and I really feel like my revisiting the topic in episode 50 was a much better video. But it's the story behind the first Alien video that makes it one of my favourite episodes, and it's also the cautionary tale that it represents that makes it so important to me.
The original Alien video was inspired by a talk delivered by Andy Bray, who was an AI lead at Creative Assembly on Alien Isolation. The talk was delivered at the Nuclei conference in Vienna, Austria in 2016, which was organised by Alex and Petra Champagnard. I was a track chair for Nuclei, a volunteer role that meant I helped find speakers to get them to the conference and support them with their talks, in a very similar way to what I now do for the AI Summit at GDC. Now, I was super excited for this talk, given I'd previously reached out to Creative Assembly to come and give a talk to us in 2015, but they never responded. So receiving a pitch for a 2016 talk, even though it wasn't in my track, was super exciting. So I go along, I watched the talk, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I scribbled down pages of notes during that talk, thinking, this is going to make a great video. But I had a few more questions, and so I ended up having a chat with Andy during the coffee break later that day, plus also getting to meet a new member of their AI team, Derek Fagan, who I mentioned already helped out with my video in Halo Wars 2. Now, the key thing about that coffee discussion is that there are facts in my original Alien video that only exist because they were shared with me over a cup of joe. Critically, how the alien has eyes in the back of its head so it can catch you walking on its tail. Yet somehow when What Culture wrote about it, they completely ignored my work and instead insisted it was in the original talk. It's almost as if they weren't there. Funny that. Anyway, I got back home not long after and then quickly put together the video. Excited that not only did I find out how it worked, but also I had some juicy extra tidbits of knowledge from the devs themselves. I put it all together, launched a video in early August of 2016, and then nothing. To this day, one of the biggest challenges is getting people to watch your content. My views are often at the mercy of the interest in the topic. Given if people aren't that interested in the game I'm exploring, or if someone else has done it already, then that might lead to a lack of interest. Interestingly, my videos on first-party PlayStation exclusives are almost always a lot less popular than you might think. Plus, I don't really follow the big games people are talking about. A lot of content creators make videos about popular games or games that are in the conversation. I explore interesting AI applications and challenges, and then tell stories about them. Sometimes it's right after a game comes out, but typically it's years later. So I don't really get the chance to feed on the gaming zeitgeist in a way that a lot of other creators do. So yeah, even 10 years later, and also with more than 200,000 subs, most of my videos don't get a huge amount of views. That's fine, it is what it is. But surely Alien Isolation was going to catch eyeballs. No. In fact, the videos before and after it, which were Transformers Fall of Cybertron and Far Cry 4, respectively did better in their first 2 to 3 months than Alien did. And I was really kind of bummed out about it, given I thought surely people would want to know about how the Xenomorph works. Fast forward to January of 2017, and something weird happened. I woke up to find my Alien video had received a significant boost of around 1,000 more views than the day before. In fact, that was about a 15% increase on the total views the video had ever had, and then it kept growing, and growing, and growing. And within weeks, the video had received over 250,000 views, and my subscriber count had tripled. At the time of writing, that video is now sitting on around 1.6 million views. Now, my thoughts on this are fairly mixed. As I say, I don't think it's one of my better videos, and if anything, I revisited the topic in episode 50 just so I could actually be happy with the quality of what I've done. But I can't discount the fact that my original Alien video is the reason my channel still exists and has since become modestly successful, and people still to this day watch that video on a daily basis. On average, that original video still gets about 300 views a day. It was really exciting and intoxicating to see the numbers on that video go up and up and up and up. But it's also a cautionary tale, because no other video has ever really had this level of success on my channel. In fact, the next most popular video is my other Alien Isolation video, and you run risk of damaging your mental health as you wonder whether you can make lightning strike twice, or whether there really is an audience that's interested in hearing you talk about things that aren't Alien Isolation. It's something any content creator who's had a modicum of success has experienced as they try to reconcile their creative interests and outputs with an audience that's held at arm's length courtesy of an algorithm. It's perhaps unsurprising to me that so many popular creators are winding down now after many years, given the challenges of chasing those numbers often does more harm than good. And so episode 15 is a favourite of mine because it reminds me just how fragile and fickle this entire thing is. Without that video, I wouldn't have benefited from its success, and it enabled for my online audience to grow drastically. But it's also a solemn reminder that success of that magnitude is an outlier and seldom straightforward. I mean, look at the view counts on the rest of the videos that I make. It's not in my best interest to try and chase this, nor is there any guarantee it will ever happen again.
Now, the next video only just aired, but this was an incredibly important episode for me to make, and one that I still pinch myself thinking that I got to make it happen: the F.E.A.R. Retrospective. This episode is a deep dive into the making of F.E.A.R, but I focus it around multiple interviews I had with the game's AI programmer Jeff Orkin. When you've spent a lot of time reading and learning about AI for games as much as I have, you begin to recognise names that have importance in the field. Jeff Orkin is one of those names, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if we just went back to F.E.A.R. one last time, to look back on the very first episode of AI in Games and do it with the guy who made it all happen to begin with. That would be just fantastic.
Now, critically, Jeff and I had never met, and never spoken outside of a very brief Twitter exchange we had like some years ago. And so I whipped up this email and asked if he would be interested in participating, and I won't lie, I was nervous. But Jeff was super excited at the prospect and was happy to do it. The only snag was we delayed it slightly, given he was going through a lot of work to finalise a round of funding for his new startup F.E.A.R. which I'm happy to say has all worked out and they're up and running successfully. Hence, that's why we launched that video in April rather than in March, which would have been the 10-year anniversary, and instead I brought forward my 10-year reflections episode to fill that March 2nd day. This episode was incredibly satisfying to put together, especially as someone for whom fear was highly influential in my own career, a point I made in my reflections episode. I was reading Jeff's paper from his GDC talk while I was in grad school. I was working on my own research on planning for games. It was great to not only hear Jeff explain all this from his perspective, but also to discover that we have similar perspectives and views on a lot of aspects of AI for games. We still have a follow-up episode on Jeff's grad school career and work at Bit.Part coming up, but it has been very rewarding to put this content together, and genuinely, it's something that I never thought I'd ever be able to do. Funny how things change over the course of a decade, huh?
Okay, so this last one might sound like a real cop-out, but the next episode of the main AI in Games series, which isn't out yet, is without a doubt one of my favourite videos I've ever made. Yeah, I know, look at Tommy, he's trying to hype up his next release. That isn't really my intent here, so let me just explain why this is an important one.
First of all, it's an important game, not just to me, but the gaming community as a whole. And while it wasn't a game I needed to know the ins and outs of versus some others, there was sufficient mystery behind it that when the opportunity arose, I decided to explore it. The second is that trying to piece it all together has taken a lot of time. A lot of my episodes are, for me, like puzzles. I find a piece of information over here, a little fact over there, and then maybe there's something that was in a press release, or a comment made by a developer in an interview 12 years ago. Some little bit of code or inner detailing a modder has managed to surface and shared on social media. But quite often the hard part is then being able to see the whole picture that these pieces comprise, a point I already discussed with the Doom 2016 episode. Quite often I have many topics I have lots of information about, but I lack that one critical component to bring it all together. And even if I can't solve the entire puzzle, having that one piece can help me see the end result and what parts are missing. It's what makes every episode of AI in Games so much work, because I'm trying to figure out how it all works, and then I need to explain it well enough that I can then explain it to you sufficiently in a video. Sometimes we have a dev talk or similar presentation that fills in the majority of the gaps, and then sometimes I also get a chance to chat with developers themselves, as discussed already, but other times I just don't get that kind of access. Contrary to the stories I've told throughout this video, access to studios is still something I struggle with regularly. For example, in the past year, I've sent out press requests to studios all across the industry, like Arcane, Hello Games, Bethesda, Frontier, Fat Shark, and either I get rejected or, more often than not, simply ignored. And that's fine, I understand the business reality of that. Like, I'm just an idiot on the internet with a modest but not huge fan base. Why would they even bother to respond? So sometimes I need to find another way to piece it together, and that can be a very long process. Like I say, many episodes are in a half-written state, and they stay like that often for months if not years at a time, until something comes along and it clicks into place, and a couple of months ago, this one finally took shape. This is a very roundabout way of saying that AI in Games number 75 has been a labour of love for quite some time now, a side project I've been chewing on for at least a year if not more, and one that I'm very excited to finally see come to pass. At the time of writing, that episode is largely scripted and I'm going to be recording it soon, and I can't wait to share it all with you in the coming months. So there we have it, some stories behind many of the episodes I've made thus far. There's actually a lot more stories we don't have time to cover, like the time I nearly knocked out Phil Harrison, and if I did, he might have then collapsed onto Steven Spielberg, how I discovered there's a whole team at Riot Games who are told by their boss to watch my videos, or how I was this close to going to Xbox HQ and also visiting several Ubisoft studios in North America, only for COVID to ruin it. And also how I spent a week in South Korea during the spread of the Omicron variant that nearly led to me being stranded outside the UK. Another time perhaps. But I figured some closing words of wisdom for anyone out there who's keen to get into games and make their way in the industry. You'll notice that every one of the stories I shared today all hinge on my building connections, and more importantly, friendships that I have now got with people across the space. It speaks to the value of networking, be it online or in person, and critically approaching each interaction with kindness rather than with an agenda. Being an asshole won't get you anywhere in the long run. Sure, I've met a few in my time, but it's more important to engage with people with a positive attitude and then also leave a positive impression while you're at it. TLDR, just don't be a dick. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my ramblings and found it interesting. Of course, if you have a favourite episode, do let me know down in the comments. It's always interesting to hear your perspectives. Given that I'm so close to all of this stuff, it's often really hard to tell. Okay, enough of this self-flagellation. I'm going to finish this Iron Brew and get back to making more videos. Take care of yourselves, and I'll be back.